Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, I'm Alex and today I'm going to be talking about all of the books that I read in January. I read 4 novels and 1 nonfiction book. I'm going to begin my video by talking about all of the books that you all hadn't really heard anything about because 2 of these books got their own reviews, so naturally the other 3 books deserve to have some extra time in this video. I read Nettle and Bone by T. Kingfisher, Pachinko by Min Jin Lee, Red Rising by Pierce Brown, Divine Rivals by Rebecca Ross, and finally, Will My Cat Eat My Eyeballs by Caitlin Doughty of Ask a Mortician fame. Kicking it off with Nettle and Bone, I decided to pick this copy up from my local library because it was the 2023 Hugo Award winner, and I wanted to check it out to see if it was going to become my next favorite thing. This is the story of Mara, whose older sister gets married off to a cruel prince, and she decides to enlist the help of some unlikely characters to kill the prince before he can kill her sister. I will start off by saying that I was worried that this was going to just be some sort of fairy tale retelling, which I'm really not a fan of. I think that they're overdone, they're everywhere. I don't want to be told the same story I've heard before in a slightly different way because I don't think it's that original, but I'm very happy to say that Nettle and Bone is not based on any specific fairy tale, it just has fairy tale elements that you will recognize. So for example, you have ghosts, princes, princesses, curses, witches in the case of the Dust Wife, who was my favorite character, and godmothers who have the ability to curse or bless babies. The sidekicks were fun in general, and I liked T. Kingfisher's writing style. This was my first experience with one of her books, and I can honestly say that I'm really interested in picking up another one of her stories, most likely What Moves the Dead. But first, I would need to read Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher, since that is what this new novel is based on. The one trope that does hold true in this book, though, is that like in many fairy tales, there are some things that just work out in order to be able to move the plot along. I also wish that the story had been a little bit longer, which is kind of a compliment really than a detriment, because I'm saying I wish that I had gotten more time in the story. So overall, I would say I really liked this book. I would recommend it, and I gave it 4 stars. Up next is Pachinko. I have owned this copy for probably the last 7 years and just now got around to reading it. It's also a National Book Award finalist for a good reason. This was the only book this month that I gave 5 stars. The story follows 4 generations of one Korean family, and the main story kicks off in the early 1900s with our character Sunja, who becomes pregnant with the baby of a wealthy businessman and gangster. She didn't know when they began their affair that he was actually married already to another woman, so he would be unable to marry her. So heartbroken and enraged, she breaks off their tryst and decides to accept the proposal of a young minister moving to Japan. Ultimately, Sunja's decision to leave Korea and go to Japan will have lasting and cascading implications on future generations of her family. This book is so beautiful and it moved me to my core, but there are also a lot of really hard topics that are covered in here, and I'm going to relay those to you because it might decide whether you would want to pick up this book or not. And so I made a list of some of the trigger warnings, and those include racism, suicide, police brutality, miscarriage, abortion, cancer, HIV, and some sexual content. Racism definitely plays the biggest part because it's the constant thread throughout the story, but I wanted to include those other trigger warnings because they're dispersed in here and different levels of quantity and severity, so just keep that in mind. I cared about these characters immensely, and I thought that the way that Min Jin Lee transitioned between the different generations was so subtle and clever. So what she does is, as the parents begin to have children, the main perspectives will stay with the parents until a time where the children are old enough to get a perspective here or there. But as the children grow up, the story slowly transitions to where it's more and more of their perspective until they have children and the cycle repeats. And I thought that it was just so well done. Pachinko is one of those stories that I will be thinking about for a long time, and it also provided a unique perspective of World War II. I have found in many books that we always end up hearing about the perspectives of the Americans, the British, the Germans, but we never hear about the Japanese or the Koreans living in Japan in squalid conditions during that time. We also learn how for Korean families, they could exist in Japan for 5 generations, where all of their children grow up there, they go to school there, they speak fluent Japanese, but because they have Korean heritage, the country still considered them to be foreigners. I'm really ashamed to admit that before reading this book, I didn't have any idea really what the relationship between Japan and Korea was, but I definitely do now. This book is an unexpected gem, so if you are a fan of historical fiction or stories taking place during World War II, I would highly recommend that you pick this up. It got 5 stars, hands down. Up next is Will My Cat Eat My Eyeballs by Caitlin Doughty. The reason that Caitlin wrote this book is because as she traveled around to different conferences over the globe, parents would bring their children to hear her talk, and the children would ask her all of these really great questions, and she decided that she was going to write a book for them in order to answer those questions. Now, I would definitely say that this isn't a book that you would just hand to a child. It's not really a children's book. I think it's more of a way for parents to be able to engage with their children when their kids ask them these kinds of questions and start that conversation. I think that's made the most obvious by the fact in the very back of the book, Caitlin actually has an interview with a child psychologist about how parents can better talk to their children about death, especially if their child is afraid of death, which I am not a parent, so I can't say necessarily whether it's helpful or not, but I will say that if I was a parent, I would have appreciated that. The book is full of some pretty interesting illustrations, so this, of course, is the first one for Will My Cat Eat My Eyeballs, which I think is really hilarious, and all of them are in this same art style, which I think is cool. Now, I definitely consider myself to be a huge Caitlin Doughty fan. I have been watching her channel for many years at this point, so I understand her sense of humor. I was actually able to read this book in her voice in my head because I've just listened to so many hours of her talking. But I will say, even for as big of a fan as I am, there were some points in this book that I got a little bit squeamish. I also want to be very clear that if you're somebody that has never watched her channel and you don't understand her sense of humor, there is the chance that you could pick up this book and find parts of it offensive. Like, if you're somebody that looks at death as being this very sacred thing, that there is no humor that can be injected into it, I would highly recommend that you do not pick this up. However, if you are a fan like me, you absolutely should get this book. I found it very informative. I also wanted to share some of the questions that were covered in here because there's actually a lot. Many questions are answered in this book. So here are some examples. When I die, will my cat eat my eyeballs? That's the very first question from this book. You also have, if someone is trying to sell a house, do they have to tell the buyer someone died there? Or is it true people see white light as they're dying? And one of my favorites and one of the most informative questions by far, can someone donate blood after they die? Which had a very surprising answer. Overall, I gave this book 4.5 stars. I had a good time. Up next is going to be Red Rising by Pierce Brown. I had so many feelings about this book that it got its own 15-minute video if you want to check that out, but I'm going to try to condense this and Divine Rivals to the shortest possible way that I can. To give you a very brief synopsis, this is the story of Darrow, who is a hell diver for the Reds, which is the lowest caste in a color-based society on Mars. The Reds have been fed a line for years that they are ushering in a new society for the other colors to come up from Earth, and all that they have to keep doing is mining a very precious element called helium-3, which allows them to terraform the planet's surface. Of course, Darrow ends up finding out that all of this has been a lie because the other colors are already here and the Reds are essentially slaves. So he is put into a position where he is able to compete as a gold, which is the highest caste in their society, to try to free the Red people. What can I say about this in short form? So it's not YA, even though a lot of people would argue that it is. I would definitely say that it's not, based off of the violent nature of the story. There's also some elements that are definitely reminiscent of other things. In the beginning, for example, I felt like Darrow was essentially Captain America put into the Hunger Games, but I will say that as the story progresses, you get more politics and intrigue that starts to happen that kind of makes the story its own thing, and I really enjoyed the politics in the story. That was my favorite part because I love that in sci-fi. Overall, I liked the book. I didn't think that the rep for everybody was great, but I was told by several people who have continued the series that it does get better and that the second book, Golden Sun, is fantastic even compared to the first book, so I'm really excited to read that. I do plan to read that towards the beginning of this year, and I overall gave Red Rising 4 stars. Last, and certainly what was least for my month of January, was Divine Rivals by Rebecca Ross. Again, you can go check out that longer review if you like. I found this book quite disappointing because it was making its rounds on BookTube and BookTok. It just wasn't what I was hoping for. To give you some background on this is the story of Iris, Winnow, and Roman Kit, two young people who are competing for a columnist position at a paper called the Oath Gazette. There is a magical war going on between two gods, Enva, who is a sky goddess, and Dacre, who is an underworld god, and so this world is torn apart by war. There are people going to the front lines, including Iris's brother Forrest, and she is left alone to take care of her alcoholic mother. Roman, on the other hand, is a very wealthy young man. He comes from a good family, but he is trying to fight his father's expectations and kind of decide his own future. I still say that this book is great for romantasy readers, maybe not so much people who are interested in historical fiction. There was too much pining, not enough war for my taste, but that's okay. Overall, I gave it 3 stars. Let me know down in the comments if you've read any of the books that you hadn't heard me talk about already and what you thought of them. I always love to hear your thoughts. And as always, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day or evening, that you all stay safe out there, and I'll see you next time.